The first time it happened, I was holding a cardboard takeout cup of coffee, the kind with the flimsy lid that never quite snaps on right, and I watched a stranger at my kitchen table lean back and describe my girlfriend like she was a story people pass around for fun. I stayed quiet because I could feel my face getting hot and I did not trust my voice. Then he laughed and asked me if I knew what she used to do, and I went perfectly still, like my body had decided silence was safer than breathing. Why would someone feel entitled to say that in my home? My name is Dashiell. I am 31, and I work as a project manager for a construction company, the kind of job where I spend my days fixing problems before they become disasters. I met Lorelai 3 years ago at a neighborhood bar that served fries in a little metal basket and acted like it was fancy. She had this calm, confident way of looking at people, like she could see through the performance and still choose kindness. I fell hard, not in a dramatic way, in a slow, stupid way that made my life rearrange itself around her without me noticing. We talked early about exclusivity. We agreed. We built a routine that felt safe. Grocery runs on Sunday morning. A weekly show we watched on the couch with our legs tangled up. Little notes on the counter. It was not flashy, but it was ours. I did not care about her past. I mean that. I never asked for details and I never wanted them. She told me she had been more adventurous than me, and I shrugged, kissed her forehead, and said I was here, not back there. The issue was never her. It was them. Her friend group had this habit of treating sex like a sport and gossip like a trophy. Most of the time I could ignore it. I have friends with obsessive hobbies too. The difference is my friends do not try to pull me into it. They do not try to embarrass me. They do not turn my relationship into a party trick. Lorelai would tell them to stop. She really would. I would watch her jaw tighten, watch her eyes flash with a warning. She would say, "Enough, seriously." But then she would laugh it off like it was harmless. Or she would change the subject like the humiliation was just a weird weather moment we all had to stand through. And they kept coming around. Every couple of months they would end up in our apartment. Sometimes it was planned. Sometimes it was just, hey, we were in the area. They would bring drinks. They would bring loud energy. They would treat my living room like a stage. I tried to be the grown man in the room. I tried to be secure. I tried to be the guy who could take a joke. But there is a difference between a joke and a test. One night, a woman named Greer pointed at a framed photo of Lorelai and me on a hiking trail and said something like, "Wow, she looks so innocent there." And then she looked right at me with a smirk that made my stomach tighten. I felt the trap forming. I kept my face neutral and asked if she wanted more ice. She laughed harder, like my refusal to react was disappointing. Another night, Briar leaned in close and asked me, in this fake friendly voice, if I ever got jealous of the things Lorelai had done before me. I said no. I said it cleanly. No, not jealous, not interested, and I watched Briar's eyes flick toward Lorelai as if she was checking whether Lorelai liked my answer. Lorelai squeezed my hand under the table afterward and whispered, "I am sorry, they are like that," as if it was a permanent personality trait we all had to accommodate. I had moved for Lorelai, not across the country or anything dramatic, but it mattered. I owned a small house in a quieter area. I rented it out and moved into her part of the city because she hated leaving her neighborhood. She said she felt safer there even though I did not. I told myself love was compromise, and my rental income made the budget easier, so it all balanced out. For a long time it did. Then my sister came to town. Eleanor is the kind of person who organizes her suitcase by outfit and carries travel-sized lotion, like it is a moral obligation. She is sweet, practical, and honestly pretty vanilla. She does not judge people, but she also does not know what to do with certain topics, so she goes quiet and stiff and tries to escape politely. She was in town for a wedding. She asked if she could stay with us for a week. Lorelai said yes immediately. She offered our guest room and bought a new set of sheets like it. It was a small celebration. The first few days went fine. Eleanor and Lorelai chatted while I cooked. We played board games. We went out for coffee. It felt like my two worlds were finally meeting in a way that could become normal. Then Lorelai's friends showed up. I did not want to be controlling. I did not want to be the boyfriend who polices who comes over. Lorelai said they were just stopping by for a bit. I told myself it would be fine. They came in loud. They were already a little buzzed. Greer hugged Lorelai too long. Briar made a comment about how cute our little domestic setup was, like it was a costume Lorelai had put on. I watched Eleanor's smile tighten. She tried to be polite. She offered snacks. She asked basic questions. Where are you from? What do you do? Normal things. And for about 10 minutes, it stayed normal. Then Greer looked at Eleanor and said, "So, do you know the wild stuff Lorelai used to do? Or is that like a secret in this house?" I felt my entire spine go cold. Lorelai snapped, "Stop, Greer. Not now." Greer lifted her hands like she was innocent. "I am just saying. I think it is funny how people think they know someone." Briar laughed, and the laugh was sharp, not warm. Briar said, "Yeah, like when Lorelai was in that whole scene," and then she stopped mid-sentence, like she wanted to savor the moment. Eleanor's eyes flicked to me. She looked confused, then she looked worried. I tried to intervene calmly. I said, "Hey, we are not doing that. Not here." Greer leaned back in her chair like she owned it. She said, "Why not? It is just her past. You said you do not care, right?" That was the first micro-twist. The way she said it. Like she knew exactly what I had said before. Like Lorelai had repeated my private reassurance to them as a shield. A shield that they were now using as a weapon. I felt betrayed in a small, quiet way that did not have a clear target. Lorelai looked mortified. She kept saying, "Stop, stop, stop," but her voice sounded thin, like she was asking the tide to reverse. Eleanor finally asked, very softly, "Dashiell, what are they talking about?" I told her the truth, but I tried to keep it vague. I said Lorelai had done things before we were together, and it was not my business, and it was not our life now. Eleanor's face changed. Not into disgust exactly, more like shock, like she had stepped into the wrong movie. movie and did not know where the exit was. Greer did not stop. She leaned forward and started describing things, not just hinting, describing, like she was reading off a menu for entertainment. Lorelai said, "I swear to God if you do not shut up." Greer laughed again. Briar pulled out her phone and tilted it toward the table. I noticed the little glowing screen. I noticed the way her thumb tapped it once like she was starting something. That was the second micro twist. It hit me like a slap. She was recording. Not a selfie. Not a picture. Recording the whole thing like it was a podcast episode. My chest went tight. I did not yell. I did not slam anything. I just stood up, walked over, and held my hand out. "Give me the phone." Briar blinked. And for a second, she looked genuinely confused, like no one had ever told her no. Then she laughed and said, "Relax. It is just for my memories." I kept my hand out. My voice came out very calm. "Give me the phone." Lorelai looked at Briar and said, "Briar, do it. Now." Briar rolled her eyes and placed the phone in my palm like she was doing me a favor. The screen was still recording. I could see the little timer moving. Eleanor stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. She said she suddenly remembered she needed to call someone. She walked into the guest room and shut the door, and I felt something inside me snap into a new shape. I did not scream. I did not threaten. I did not throw anybody out like a dramatic hero. I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the kind of smile I use at work when a subcontractor lies to my face and I already have the email chain. I said, "Okay, cool. Everyone take a breath. Let us reset." Greer looked pleased, like she thought she had won. Lorelai looked at me like she was trying to read my mind and failing. I turned the phone screen toward them. I said, "I am going to save this. Not because I care about whatever you were trying to say about Lorelai. I do not. I am saving it because you walked into my home and tried to humiliate me and my sister, and you thought you were safe doing it." Briar's smile flickered. Greer's eyes narrowed. Lorelai whispered my name like a warning. I nodded once, like I heard her, like I respected her, but my body stayed steady. I said, "You all need to leave." Greer opened her mouth, probably to make it into a joke, but I cut her off without raising my voice. "Leave, now." They stood up slow and irritated, but they left. Lorelai closed the door behind them and turned to me with tears in her eyes. She said, "That was humiliating. You embarrassed them." I stared at her for a second, and my heart did that painful thing where it wants to protect someone and resent them at the same time. I said, "Lorelai, they humiliated us. They humiliated my sister. They recorded it." She covered her face.
She said I did not know Briar was recording.
I believed her. That was the worst part. I believed she did not know, which meant her friends were not just rude. They were reckless. They were opportunists. Eleanor did not come out for a while. When she finally did, her eyes were red like she had been holding back tears. She said she was going to stay at a hotel for the rest of the visit. She said she was sorry. She said she did not want to make it a bigger issue. Lorelai tried to apologize to her. Eleanor nodded politely but kept her distance. That night, after Eleanor left, Lorelai crawled into bed and tried to hold me like nothing had changed, but my body stayed rigid. My mind kept replaying Briar's thumb hitting that record button, kept replaying Greer's grin, kept replaying Eleanor's chair scraping back. Lorelai whispered, "You really do not care about my past, right?" I swallowed. I said, "I do not care about your past. I care about your present." She went quiet. In the morning, I made coffee. The same cardboard cup from the corner shop, the lid still flimsy, the same ordinary routine that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Lorelai stood in the doorway watching me. She said, "What are you going to do with that recording?" I looked down at Briar's phone in my hand because I had not given it back. I had powered it off. I had kept it quietly. I said, "I am going to do the thing you keep avoiding. I am going to make sure this never happens again." Lorelai's face tightened. She said, "You cannot control my friends." I nodded. I said, "You are right. I cannot." She exhaled like she thought she had won an argument. She said, "So what? You are going to punish me for having friends?" I took a slow sip of coffee. I let the silence stretch because I could feel her getting impatient, and impatience makes people careless. I said, "No, I am going to listen, and I am going to take notes, and I am going to choose what kind of life I want." Lorelai stared at me, confused and hurt. She said, "Dashiell, what does that mean?" I did not answer, not yet, because I realized something terrifying and clear. This was not just about rude friends. This was about what Lorelai protected and what she was willing to sacrifice, and I was about to find out. Quick real-life pause when I'm editing these late at night. I get tired, and your comments are what keep me going. Hit like, subscribe, and tell me your city, state, or country. Alright, now let me take you back. Later that afternoon, I went to return Briar's phone. I did not tell Lorelai where I was going. I just said I was running an errand. She barely looked up. She was still angry, still wounded, still acting like I was the one who crossed a line. I walked to Briar's building with my calm face on. I knocked. Briar opened the door with a smug smile that faded when she saw the phone in my hand. She said, "Oh, you decided to be reasonable." I smiled again, small and controlled. I said, "Yeah, I just had one question." Briar tilted her head. "What?" I lifted the phone slightly and said, "Who were you sending that recording to?" Her eyes flicked, just for a second, over my shoulder, like she was checking for someone behind me, and that tiny glance told me everything. Her eyes flicked past me again, like she was checking whether someone was listening from the hallway. Then she straightened her shoulders and tried to turn it into a joke. Briar said, "You are being dramatic." I kept my voice gentle. I was almost polite. I said, "I am not asking to be dramatic.
I am asking because you recorded something in my home.
With my sister there, and you looked proud about it. People only do that when they have an audience." Briar's smile tightened. She leaned against the doorframe, blocking the entrance with her body, and said, "You did not even give it back right away." "That is kind of creepy, Dashiell." I nodded like I was taking feedback, like this was a meeting. I said, "Maybe, but I am still asking the question." Her eyes narrowed, and she sighed and said, "Fine. It was just going to the group chat. That is it. Everyone sends stuff. You do not have to be such a cop about it." Group chat. chat. The words hit me in the stomach, not because I was shocked that it existed, but because I could suddenly picture it. A place where Lorelai's life was entertainment. A place where my home was a set. A place where my sister's discomfort was a punchline. I did not react. I just asked, what group chat? Briar rolled her eyes. She said, the one we all have. Our friends? It is not that deep. I smiled softly. I said, who is in it? Briar laughed like I was being ridiculous. She said, Greer, me, Holland, and a few others. Just people who have known Lorelai forever. People who know the real her. The real her. I let that sit between us. I wanted to say, I know the real her too. I wanted to say, you do not own her story. But I could feel my anger turning into something sharper. Something useful. So I asked one small question, the kind that sounds harmless. I said, and Lorelai is in this chat. Briar's face did that tiny shift again. The blink that is a fraction too slow. The pause that is a confession. She said sometimes. Sometimes meant yes. I nodded. I looked down at the phone in my hand, like I was making sure it still worked, and I said, okay, thanks. Briar's shoulders relaxed. She thought the conversation was ending. She thought she had contained it. Then I added casually, almost as an afterthought, can you show me the message where you were going to send it? Briar froze. I could see her trying to decide whether to fight me or charm me. She chose charm. She smiled and said, why would I do that? I lifted my gaze, calm, flat. I said, because I am about to hand you your phone back, and I'm deciding whether to trust that this stops here. If you show me, we can both pretend it was a stupid mistake and move on. That was not really true. I already knew it would not stop here. But sometimes people give you what you want if you make it sound like it will protect them. Briar hesitated. Then she said, you are not my boyfriend. You cannot tell me what to do. I nodded again. I said, you are right. I cannot. I held the phone out toward her, screen facing down, and said, then take it. We are done. Her hand moved fast, snatching it like she thought I might change my mind. She stepped back into her apartment and started to close the door. And then, in the last second before the latch caught, she said, just so you know, Lorelai is not going to like this. The door shut. I stood there in the hallway and exhaled slowly. My hands were steady, but my chest hurt. Not jealousy, not insecurity. Something uglier. The feeling of realizing someone you love is surrounded by people who enjoy hurting others, and she has decided that is normal. I walked home without rushing. I took the long route, letting the cold air clear my head. When I got back, Lorelai was on the couch with her knees pulled up, phone in her hand, eyes fixed on the screen like she had been staring at it for a long time. She looked up when I entered. Her face was guarded. She said, where were you? I hung my jacket, washed my hands, moved like everything was normal. I said I returned Briar's phone. Lorelai's eyes widened slightly. She said, you went to her place. I nodded. I kept my tone neutral. I said, I asked her who she was sending the recording to. Lorelai's throat bobbed when she swallowed. She said, and I watched her carefully. I did not accuse. I did not demand. I just asked one question. I said, are you in a group chat where they talk about you? About us? Lorelai blinked. Then she looked away, like she suddenly found the corner of the room fascinating. She said, it is just jokes. I felt my stomach drop in a slow, controlled way. I stayed calm. I said, are you in it? Lorelai said, yes, but I do not participate. I let the silence stretch, because the silence makes people fill it. It makes them talk. Lorelai added quickly, I do not share things about you. They just talk. They have always talked. It is how they are. Like that. I sat down across from her. My voice came out low. I said, did you tell them I do not care about your past? Lorelai's eyebrows pulled together. She said, I was defending you. That answer made my jaw tighten. She said it like she had done something kind, like she had protected me, but all it did was give them a perfect line to throw in my face. I said, Lorelai, when you give them details about our conversations, you are inviting them into our relationship. She looked wounded. She said I did not think it mattered. I could see her honestly believing that, and that scared me more than any mean thing Greer could say. I stood up and walked to the kitchen, not because I needed water, but because I needed space between my feelings and my mouth. I poured a glass anyway. The sound of water hitting. The cup was steady, reliable. I wished my life felt like that. When I turned back, Lorelai was watching me like she expected an explosion. I did not explode. I said, I need to understand something. Why do you keep them close when they do this? Lorelai's lips trembled. She said, because they were there for me when I was younger, when I was messy, when I did not know how to say no. I nodded slowly. That was the first time she had said something that sounded real. Not a shield, not a joke, a truth with weight. I asked, did they make it messy? Or did they just cheer while you were? Lorelai flinched like I had slapped her. She said, that is not fair. I said, I am not trying to be fair. I am trying to be honest. Lorelai stood up too. She crossed her arms. She looked angry now, but her eyes were glossy. She said, you act like they are monsters. They are my friends. I held her gaze. I said, then tell me why my sister left our home. Lorelai's anger faltered. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She whispered, I did not want that to happen. I said, but it did. Lorelai shook her head. She said, you are punishing me for something I did not do. I swallowed hard. I said, I am responding to something you keep allowing. Lorelai stared at me for a long time. Then she said, what do you want? Do you want me to cut them off? I could feel the trap in the question. If I said yes, I would become the controlling boyfriend. If I said no, nothing would change. So I answered carefully. I said, I want you to choose me when they disrespect our life. Lorelai's shoulders sagged a little. She said, I do choose you. I shook my head. I said, no, you choose peace with them, and you ask me to swallow the discomfort. Lorelai's eyes flashed. She said, so you are going to leave me? I did not answer right away. I watched her face. I watched the fear under the anger. I watched the part of her that still wanted safety. I said, I am not making threats. I am not giving ultimatums. I am telling you that my life has limits. Lorelai's phone buzzed in her hand. She looked down. Her face changed instantly. Her eyes widened, then narrowed. I asked quietly, who is that? Lorelai's thumb hovered over the screen. She said, it is nothing. Nothing meant everything. I walked closer, not fast, not aggressive, just close enough to make it hard for her to hide behind distance. I said, Lorelai, show me. Her hand tightened around the phone. She said, you do not get to demand that. I nodded. I said, you are right, I do not. Then I sat back down, calmer than before, and said, okay, keep it. Lorelai blinked, confused by how easily I let go. She said, what? I looked at her like I was tired, like the fight was draining and I had no interest in it. I said, keep it. You can keep your phone. You can keep your group chat. You can keep your friends. I am not here to police you. Lorelai's breathing quickened. She said, then what are you doing? I lifted my eyes. I said, I am paying attention. That night, Lorelai went to bed early. She curled up facing the wall. I lay there listening to the tiny sounds of the apartment, the fridge hum, the pipes, the distant traffic. My mind kept replaying the way Briar had said Lorelai would not like this. Around midnight, Lorelai's phone buzzed again, and again, she did not move, but I could tell she was awake. I could tell because her breathing changed. It got shallow. I stared at the ceiling. I thought about the group chat. I thought about the recording. I thought about how easy it would be for them to twist this into a story where I was the villain and Lorelai was the misunderstood heroine trapped by a judgmental boyfriend. And then I realized the third micro twist. They did not just want to embarrass me. They wanted to control Lorelai, because if they kept me uncomfortable, kept me defensive, kept me apologizing for boundaries, then Lorelai would stay bonded to them. She would keep returning to the people who demanded the least growth from her. The next morning, Lorelai acted normal. Too normal. She offered to make breakfast. She kissed my cheek like it was a reset button. She laughed at something I said like she wanted to erase the last day with sweetness. But her eyes kept darting to her phone. Around late afternoon, she finally said, Greer wants to come by and talk. I stayed still. I said, about what? Lorelai forced a smile. She said, just to clear the air. Clear the air. Like the air was the problem. I nodded slowly. I said, okay. Lorelai's relief was instant. She said, really? I said, yes. Let her come. I want everyone to feel comfortable. Lorelai looked at me with suspicion, like she was waiting for the catch, but I kept my face calm. I went back to rinsing a plate, like this was no big deal. Lorelai did not know what I had already done that morning. I had called Eleanor not to beg her to come back, not to convince her Lorelai was good. I had simply asked, can you send me a written note about what happened? Just what you heard, what you saw, and how it made you feel. I told her it was for my own clarity. Eleanor had agreed. She said she wanted to help. Her voice sounded sad. I also texted my friend Sterling, who works in HR at my company, and asked a simple question. If someone records in your home without consent and shares it, what are the legal angles in our state? Sterling did not ask why. He just sent me a couple of resources and told me to document everything. I did not tell Lorelai any of that. I just said, yes, let Greer come over. Because sometimes the best revenge is letting people show you who they are. Clearly, on your own timeline. Greer arrived with that same confident swagger, like she was the one granting us her presence. She stepped into my living room and said, well, look who is acting reasonable today. Lorelai laughed nervously. She said, Greer, please. I stood up, shook Greer's hand, and smiled like a host. I said, welcome. Sit wherever you like. Greer sat. She crossed her legs. She looked around like she was assessing the place. Then she looked at Lorelai and said, so, is he done being weird? Lorelai stiffened. I answered before Lorelai could. I said, I am not weird. I just like clarity. Greer smirked. She said, clarity. Okay. I nodded. I said, I have one question for you, Greer, and I want you to answer it honestly. Greer's eyes gleamed like she loved an audience. She said, ask. I leaned forward slightly. My voice stayed calm. I said, why did you want my sister to know those things about Lorelai? Greer's smile did not move, but her eyes changed. She said, I did not want anything. I was just talking. I nodded. I said, okay. Another question. Greer laughed. Sure. I said, why was Briar recording? Greer's smirk faltered. Lorelai's head snapped toward Greer. Greer said she was not recording. I turned my head slightly toward Lorelai. I asked Lorelai, did Briar record? Lorelai looked trapped. She whispered, yes. Greer's eyes flashed with irritation at Lorelai just for a second, and that tiny flash told me everything I needed to know. Greer had expected loyalty, silence, obedience. I nodded. I looked back at Greer. I said, so you lied? Greer straightened. She said, I did not know. I said, but you were fine. With the conversation continuing while my sister was clearly uncomfortable, Greer rolled her eyes. She said, your sister is uptight. I smiled faintly. I said, maybe, but it was still my home. Greer leaned forward now, voice sharper. She said, are you trying to shame Lorelai for her past? I kept my tone even. I said, no, I am trying to protect my present. Greer laughed like that was the funniest thing she had ever heard. Then she said the line that finally made everything click into place. She said, you will not last. They never do. Lorelai went pale. I asked quietly, what do you mean they never do? Greer's smile widened, and for a moment she looked almost proud of herself. She said nothing. Just history. Lorelai whispered, Greer, stop. I did not raise my voice. I just reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Greer's eyes flicked to it. Her smirk returned. She said, what? You're recording me now? That is rich. I looked at her calmly and said, no, I do not need to record you. Then I placed my phone on the table, screen up and tapped once. Eleanor's written message was open, long and detailed, describing the night, describing the recording, describing how she felt unsafe in our home. Greer's face changed when she saw my sister's name. Lorelai stared at the screen like she was seeing the consequences for the first time. I looked at Greer and asked softly, do you want to keep pretending this is just jokes? Greer's jaw clenched. She stood up fast. She said, you are insane. I stayed seated. I did not move. I just said, Greer, you came here to clear the air, so clear it. Tell Lorelai why you said they never do. do? Greer's eyes darted to Lorelai, then back to me. And in that pause, I understood I was not asking the right question. The right question was who was they? Because suddenly, I was not sure I was the first boyfriend they had tested like this. Greer's mouth opened, and for a moment I saw panic flash behind her confidence. It was gone fast, replaced with that familiar smirk. She said, "You are reading way too much into a throwaway comment." I kept my eyes on her. I let my voice stay calm. I said, "You said it like a fact. Like you have watched this happen before. So tell me, who is they?" Lorelai's hands were trembling. She looked between us like she wanted to disappear into the couch. Greer shrugged. Too casual. Too practiced. She said, "Guys who think they are different. Guys who act like they can handle Lorelai, but then they get weird about her." Lorelai flinched. She said, "Greer, stop talking like I am not here." Greer leaned back and lifted her chin. She said, "I am protecting you, Lorelai. You always pick men who say they are fine with you, and then they make you feel dirty for being yourself." I felt my throat tighten. Not because her words stung me, but because they were designed to. They were bait. If I argued, I would sound defensive. If I stayed quiet, she would claim I had nothing to say. So I asked a small question instead. I said, "If you are protecting her, why did you try to humiliate her in front of my sister?" Greer's eyes narrowed. She said, "We were having fun." Lorelai whispered, "It was not fun." Greer snapped her head toward Lorelai and her voice changed. It got colder, sharper. She said, "You are seriously going to take his side right now?" There it was. Not friendship, ownership. I watched Lorelai's face, the way her confidence crumpled for a second, the way she still wanted to keep the peace. And I realized Greer did not need to convince me of anything. She just needed Lorelai to doubt herself. I stayed calm. I said, "Greer, I am going to ask you one more thing, and then you can leave." Greer crossed her arms. She said, "Make it good." I said, "Why was Briar recording, and what were you planning to do with that recording?" Greer laughed, but it sounded forced. She said, "Nothing. It is just content. People share things. Get over it. Content." The word made my stomach turn. Like my home was a clip? Like my relationship was a scene? Lorelai's voice came out small. She said, "Greer, there was a recording." Greer stared at Lorelai like she was betraying her. Then she looked back at me. Her eyes were hard now. She said, "Fine. You want honesty? I will give you honesty." My chest went tight, but I did not move. Greer said, "When Lorelai gets serious, she forgets us. She stops coming around. She starts acting like she is better than the life she lived. And then she ends up stuck playing house, shrinking herself for a man who will eventually judge her anyway." Lorelai whispered, "That is not true." Greer leaned forward. Her voice dropped like she wanted it to feel intimate, like a confession. She said, "It is true. And I am not going to watch her get trapped again." Again. Lorelai looked up sharply. She said again. Greer's jaw tightened. She had not meant to say it, or she had meant to, and she had not meant for Lorelai to catch it. Lorelai said, "What do you mean again?" "I have never been trapped." Greer scoffed. She said, "You were miserable with your last boyfriend." Lorelai shook her head. She said, "I was not miserable. I was scared all the time because you kept telling me he was going to leave. You kept telling me he was embarrassed of me." Greer's expression flickered. Lorelai took a breath like she was pulling air out of deep water. Lorelai said, "You used to show me screenshots. You said he was texting other girls. You said he was laughing about me." Greer's eyes flashed. She said, "Because it was true." Lorelai stared at her. Then she looked at me, and I could see the memory forming into a new shape. Lorelai said, "Wait, those screenshots. You never told me who sent them to you." Greer's mouth pressed into a line. She looked toward the door. I stayed seated. I kept my voice level. I said, "Greer, are you the one who made Lorelai think her last relationship was a joke?" Greer barked a laugh. She said, "You are insane." I did not argue. I simply reached for my phone again and tapped into a file. Not a recording. Not something illegal. Just the safest thing in the world. A time-stamped note Eleanor had written. A screenshot Sterling had sent me of a public legal resource page. And one more thing. A message I had received that afternoon, after I returned Briar's phone. Briar had texted Lorelai, not me. Lorelai had not replied, but she had not deleted it either. I had seen it pop up on her lock screen when she set her phone down on the counter. The message said, "Tell your man to chill or Greer is posting it." Posting it. So I asked Lorelai earlier quietly to forward it to me. I did not tell her why. I just said I needed to understand what was happening. Lorelai had hesitated. Then she forwarded it. That was the moment she chose something. Not perfectly, not bravely, but she did. I held my phone out slightly so Greer could see the words. Greer's face went blank. Lorelai's voice cracked. She said, "Greer, you were going to post it." Greer's smile returned, but it was ugly now. She said, "So what? Maybe you need to be reminded where you came from." Lorelai stood up so fast the coffee table shook. Her voice rose, not into screaming, but into something raw and sharp. Lorelai said, "Where I came from is me. It is my life. You do not get to use it like a weapon." Greer's eyes narrowed. She said, "You would not even have those memories without us." Lorelai's hands balled into fists. She looked like she might cry. Then she did something else. She went very still. She said, "You are not my friend." Greer's expression hardened. She said, "Fine, pick him. See how long he lasts." Then Greer turned toward the door. I did not stop her. I did not insult her. I did not chase her. I just said, "Greer." She paused without turning around. I said, "You walked into my home. You recorded my sister without consent. You threatened to post something humiliating. And you admitted you have done this before. So here is what is going to happen next." Greer finally looked back at me, eyes sharp. I said, "Nothing loud, nothing dramatic. You will not get a scene to laugh about." Greer smirked like she expected me to bluff. I continued, still still calm, I said, "You will never step into this home again. If you do, I will call the police, not to make a point, but to document trespassing. I will not argue with you about it. I will not negotiate." Greer's smirk faltered. I said, "And if you post anything from that recording, I will take the simplest legal route available. I will not post about you. I will not expose you for entertainment. I will just hand over documentation to the right people, in the right order, and let your own choices speak." Greer's jaw clenched. She looked at Lorelai. Lorelai did not look back. Greer's face twisted like she had tasted something bitter. Then she left. The door shut. The apartment went quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. Lorelai stood there shaking. Then she slid down onto the couch like her legs forgot how to hold her. I sat beside her, but not too close. I gave her space to feel what she needed to feel. Lorelai whispered, "I thought they were just loud. I thought it was harmless." I stared at the wall for a second. I felt tired. Not sleepy tired. Soul tired. I said, "They were not loud. They were strategic." Lorelai wiped her face with the heel of her hand. She whispered, "I hate that you were right." I looked at her. I said, "I did not want to be right." Lorelai inhaled shakily. She said, "What now?" I took a slow breath. I said, "Now you decide what kind of life you want." Lorelai's eyes searched mine. She said, "Are you leaving me?" I did not answer quickly. I made sure my voice would not wobble. I said, "I love you, but I am not building a future with people who treat my home like content." Lorelai nodded, tears falling. She said, "I will cut them off." I believed she meant it in that moment, but I also knew something about moments. They fade. Fear fades. Old patterns return, so I did not celebrate. I said, "Then do it." "Not for me, for you." Lorelai reached for her phone. Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped it once. She picked it up, unlocked it, and opened the group chat. Her face changed as she scrolled. It went from grief to shock to something like nausea. She whispered, "Oh my God." I leaned in slightly. I did not take the phone. I did not invade her space. I just watched her eyes. Lorelai whispered, "They have been talking about you for months." My chest tightened, but I stayed quiet. Lorelai kept scrolling faster now. She covered her mouth. She whispered, "They have bets." I finally spoke. My voice was low. I said, "Bets on what?" Lorelai's eyes filled again. She said, "Bets on when you will propose. Bets on how long until I mess it up. Bets on how long until you leave." And they are laughing. They are laughing at me, Dashiell. She looked at me like she expected me to tell her it was okay. I did not. I said, "Lorelai, this is what I mean. This is the cost." Lorelai nodded, tears running down her cheeks. She opened her settings, blocked numbers, blocked accounts, removed herself from the chat. She did it all in silence, face tight with determination. Then she set the phone down and said, "I want to move." The word surprised me. Lorelai said, "I want to leave this neighborhood. I want to leave this city if I have to. I am tired of being the version of myself that needs their approval." I stared at her. I felt something shift in my chest. Not relief, something warmer. Something like hope, but cautious. I said, "Are you saying that because you are scared right now, or because you mean it?" Lorelai wiped her face. She looked me in the eye. She said, "I mean it. And I know you gave up your safer place for me. I know you did. I was selfish, and I was afraid, and I hid behind it. I do not want to be that person anymore." I swallowed. I nodded slowly. In the weeks that followed, we did not announce anything to anyone. We did not post. We did not make speeches. We did not perform our healing. We just changed our life quietly. We stopped answering calls. We declined invitations. We made our home private again. And then we moved. Not with a dramatic breakup or a public war. We moved like adults who finally understood that peace is not something you beg for. It is something you build brick by brick, and you do not let anybody vandalize it. My sister came back a month later to visit again. She stayed with us, and she laughed with Lorelai like the awkward night had finally loosened its grip. Eleanor hugged Lorelai before she left and whispered something I could not hear. After Eleanor drove away, Lorelai turned to me and said, "I owe you an apology." I shook my head. I said, "You do not owe me words. You owe yourself boundaries." Lorelai nodded. She said, "I already made them." She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. I froze. Lorelai's cheeks went pink. She looked embarrassed, but not in a childish way, in a human way. She said, "I bought this before all of this happened. I was going to propose to you. I was going to make it a joke. Like, if you do not ask me, I will ask you. And then I got scared because my friends said you were never going to commit." My throat went tight. Lorelai opened the box. Inside was a simple band, not flashy, just solid and honest. Like a promise that did not need an audience. I stared at it. I felt angry at the group chat all over again. Not because they were mean, but because they had almost stolen this moment with their poison. Lorelai whispered, "I let them get in my head. I let them treat love like a game." I reached out and took her hand. I did not speak right away. I just held it. Then I said, "We do this our way. Quiet. Real." Lorelai nodded, tears in her eyes again, but this time the tears looked like relief. She slipped the ring onto my finger with shaking hands, and the final twist hit me like a clean wave. All this time, I thought I was protecting my future from her past, but what I actually protected was her from the people who kept trying to keep her small. I looked down at the ring, then up at her, and I said the simplest truth I had felt in weeks. I said, "They never really knew you, Lorelai. They just knew how to use you." Discussion section. I need to step out of the story for a second, because this kind of situation messes with your head. When people call it jokes, it makes you doubt your own instincts. You start asking yourself if you are too sensitive. You start trying to prove you are chill, and the more you try to prove it, the more they push. That is the trap. A lot of manipulation is not loud. It is small. It is repetitive. It is disguised as friendship. They do not have to scream at you to control you. They just have to make you feel embarrassed for having boundaries. And once you feel embarrassed, you start abandoning yourself. What helped me was staying calm. Not because I am some perfect person. Because calm makes patterns obvious. Calm gives you time to notice who is protecting peace and who is feeding chaos. Also, I learned something uncomfortable. Some people do not want you happy. They want you familiar. They want you to stay in the role they understand. Because if you grow, it reminds them they are still stuck. So the quiet move is not revenge as a performance. It is removing access. It is choosing privacy. It is letting your life become boring to the people who only show up for drama. And if someone calls that rude, I have a new definition of rude now. Rude is disrespecting someone's home and calling it fun. Rude is using someone's past like a leash. Rude is making love feel like something you have to defend. The calm response is the loudest boundary you will ever set.